If I can ask everyone to please take your seats so we can get started. Good evening, everyone. As we begin, the very first announcement I have to make, you know what's coming, which is to please make sure that your cell phone has been silenced. And I have learned in the last month or two to add a second announcement as well. Raise your hand if you have an Apple Watch and you're wearing it and you don't know how to turn the ringer off on that. All right. If you want in a moment, I can meet you in the back and help you turn the ringer off on the Apple Watch as well, because I found that those are the things that go off these days. But it's a pleasure to be with everyone this evening, and I want to begin with a word of gratitude to Mason Slane for making the connection and bringing Michael Abramowitz to us this evening. We tonight are in for a treat, because we're going to learn not only what all the world's problems are, but also what the solutions are and how we're going to be able to fix everything just in one night. Right, Mike? In 30 minutes, we're going to solve the world's problems. Now, it is a pleasure this evening to welcome to Temple Bethel Michael J. Abramowitz, who is the president of Freedom House, a nonpartisan voice dedicated to supporting democracy. There he oversees a unique combination of analysis, advocacy, and direct support to frontline defenders of freedom, especially those working in closed authoritarian societies. Previously, he has worked as the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's, is it Levine or Levine? Levine Institute for Holocaust Education, prior to which he led the museum's genocide prevention efforts. He spent the first 24 years of his career at the Washington Post, where he was a national editor and then the White House correspondent. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and was formerly a Marshall Memorial Fellow at the German Marshall Fund and a media fellow at the Hoover Institution. A graduate of Harvard College, Michael is a board member of the National Security Archive, a member of the Human Freedom Advisory Council for the George W. Bush Presidential Center, and a member of the Advisory Council of the Kroc Institute for Tech Diplomacy at Purdue. Is that Keith Kroc? Ah. In the last few months, he has been interviewed and contributed to a variety of, this is just in the last few months, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, the Dallas Morning News, CNBC, Newsweek, the New Yorker, Bloomberg, and The Guardian. So, Michael, on behalf of Temple Bethel, it is a pleasure and welcome.
Welcome. It's great to see all of you. And it's really a pleasure to be here in Boca. I never turned down an invitation to speak in Florida in February or March. So thank you, Mason, for putting this together, and thank you, Rabbi, for inviting me. I was actually on the other side of the state yesterday, where I spoke I was a keynote speaker at the Holocaust Museum and Education Center in Naples, and that was quite interesting. I did work at the Holocaust Museum in Washington for 8 years, and it was really an amazing experience. And I do think there actually is a connection between the issues that I worked on at the Holocaust Museum and the issues that I'm now working on at Freedom House, and we can talk about that a little bit. What I thought I would do today is tell you a little bit about Freedom House, what we do, and kind of our perspective on what's happening in the world. I was going to try to basically run through a few slides. I promise you it won't last more than an hour. No, it's going to be about 10 minutes, and then we are going to, the rabbi and I are going to engage in a conversation, and he's already been lining up some kind of tough questions for me, I know. So, so why don't we first go to the next slide? Okay. So I love the founding story about Freedom House. We're an 81-year-old organization. We were founded in 1941, and we were founded by a group of individuals, including the two people on that slide. On the left, let me say on the right, is Eleanor Roosevelt and Wendell Willkie, who had run against Eleanor's husband, Franklin, for president in 1940, Republican and Democrat. Think about that happening today. But I thought if you know one thing about Freedom House, I always say we are deeply nonpartisan, and we try to work across the aisle to advance our ideals. if you saw the Ken Burns movie recently, did you see the Ken Burns movie last fall about the United States and the Holocaust? It kind of covers the period around when Freedom House was founded, because at the time, America was deeply isolationist. I find this number incredible. The Gallup poll found in 1940, as Hitler was beginning to gobble up territory in Europe and the Japanese were taking over large parts of Asia, that 9 in 10 Americans did not want to enter the war in Europe. 9 in 10 Americans basically did not see that fight as something that they were interested in engaging with. And it's actually an interesting reminder. So what happening today in terms of some of the movements in our country, they're not altogether new. The America First movement, which Freedom House was involved in fighting against, is a now new version of the America First movement. But Freedom House, the founders really believed that the strength of democracy, the strength of American democracy, was also related to the strength of global democracy, that there was a relationship, and that America, in the memorable words of Herbert Agar, who was one of the founders of Freedom House, was not safe because they did not care about the safety of others when they were threatened before Pearl Harbor. Now all that changed after Pearl Harbor. But that's sort of that spirit of nonpartisanship, of caring about democracy both at home and abroad, is really shot through our ethos at Freedom House, and it's in our DNA. Let's go to the next slide, please. So today we are a independent, nonpartisan organization. We really do 3 things. The first thing we do is we try to mobilize governments and international organizations to support human rights, to support democracy. People ask me, well, what's an example of what you're doing? I often say the Global Magnitsky Act. Have any of you heard about the Global Magnitsky Act? This is an important piece of human rights legislation that allows the US government, and now other governments have adopted this, to directly sanction individual human rights violators in other countries. So if you think about in Iran, Russia, Belarus, where people's human rights are being profoundly affected, we now have the tools to go back and sanction individual violators. A lot of our budget and a lot of our efforts are also focused on providing direct support to civil society groups. We work in 14 different countries around the world. We are supporting human rights defenders, supporting human rights activists in their ability to carry on their job. And that's also something that I'm very proud of. We've been in, for instance, well, I'll tell you more about that in a second. But then the final thing we do, and a lot of my talk today is going to focus on this, we try to inform the world about the state of global freedom and emerging threats to democracy and human rights. So that's Freedom House. Inform, mobilize, protect. An example of what we do is in Ukraine, which is one of the most important events related to global freedom happening right now. Freedom House is working on Ukraine in a number of different ways. First of all, we're working with partners on the ground, human rights groups, civil society groups in Ukraine to help strengthen their capacity to do work. We also are really working hard to get the US government, working with, not alone obviously, but with other organizations to try to really make the case to the US government that they need to support the Ukrainian people in their defense of their country against authoritarian aggression. And we also are, for many years, really documenting trends in human rights and democracy in Ukraine. That kind of gives you an example of like one case of what we do. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so I want to really focus my discussion on what our major product is, which is assessing the state of freedom around the world. So in 1973, Freedom House started, and this is a picture from 1973, started a project called Freedom in the World, which every year tries to assess the level of political rights and civil liberties in every country in the world. And we've now been doing it for 50 years. Let's go to the next slide for a second. And this chart, kind of shows the ebb and flow of democratization. The big story, when Freedom in the World started in 1973, it was another kind of low period for democracy in the world. Democracy, free countries, free, partly free, not free, free countries were really concentrated in Europe and the Americas. And a lot of the world lived in not free countries. You think about China, the whole Soviet bloc. And for 30 years, there was this incredible wave of democratization around the world. And democracy was brought to Eastern Europe, the fall of the Berlin Wall, but it was also, thank you for, that's good, it was also brought to Latin America. You had countries like Taiwan and South Korea, countries that had been military dictatorships, Spain, Portugal, all became democracies. This is a great wave of democratization, and this is our map of freedom that we release every year. This is a 2023 map, and you see in purple are the unfree countries, green are the free countries, and the yellow are the partly free. Our goal in the end is to have the world turn the map green. I don't think that's likely to happen in my lifetime, but that's the goal. Let's go to the next slide. So we actually just are out last week with the major findings of our report, and this is kind of captured in this slide. So we've been in what we call a democratic recession. That's a term that was coined by Larry Diamond, who's a professor at Stanford. And what do we mean by a democratic recession? Well, every year for the last 17 years, more countries have declined in respect for political rights and civil liberties, things like press freedom, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, having free and fair elections. We measure 25 different indicators of political rights and civil liberties. And basically, for the last 17 years, more countries are declining every year than have had improvements. And this is happening all over the world. It's happening, obviously, countries like China and Russia, which have gotten more repressive, but also, and we can talk more about this, there have been countries, strong democracies, India, Poland, Hungary, and to some extent the United States, that have eroded. So we have a little bit of hopeful sign last week, because for the first time in 17 years, the gap has really narrowed between countries that are declining and improving. And so I wrote a piece last week for the Washington Post, and I said, maybe we're reaching a turning point in this struggle between democracy and authoritarianism. We'll see. Let's go to the next slide, please. Obviously, as I said earlier, we really see Ukraine as the kind of front line in the struggle between freedom and autocracy. I believe that one of the reasons Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine was because the presence of a democracy on his border was very threatening to him, his rule, and so I think he couldn't countenance that. I mean, there are some other reasons too. I'm sure geopolitics played a role, but this full-scale invasion of Ukraine led to a major score decline in Ukraine this past year, but also I think the resistance of the Ukrainian people to the invasion, to me, is kind of a hopeful sign for democracy, and we're pleased at Freedom House. We're supportive of the administration, the Western democratic governments, to support Ukraine in this struggle for democracy, for freedom. Let's go to the next slide. I'm a former reporter. As Rabbi said, I used to work at the Washington Post, so I care deeply about freedom of the press. This is a major thing we look at Freedom House, and I think one of the things that's quite interesting, if you take a longitudinal look at our report, that press freedom has really been under attack for the last 17 years. That is one of the areas that I think we could say is a driver of democratic decline, and also restrictions on personal expression. I think if you think about it, when I was a reporter, I think the situation has really deteriorated since then. There are physical attacks on journalists. You think about a country like Turkey, where dozens of journalists are in jail, Mexico, where journalists are being murdered, Russia, where journalists are being murdered. I think the United States still has a very strong and lively free press, but there have been efforts to intimidate reporters. I think the thing that's also, I think, a really important part to say about this, two things. One is the economic dimensions. When I was a reporter at the Washington Post, we had a huge metro staff that covered local news, covered public affairs in the area. That has really narrowed, and that's a story that's being told all around the world, right? In the United States and around the world, where there's such economic pressures on papers changing the economic nature of journalism that there's much less coverage of public affairs, investigative reporting. That's something I really worry about. Let's go to the next slide. It's not all bad news. I describe myself in an interview once as kind of the skunk at the garden party, always kind of complaining about things. But I do feel like when I look around the world, and we put some of the countries that have been sort of bright spots in our survey every year, but I think one of the things to me that gives me a lot of hope is that there are these protest movements that are happening around the world. I mean, the biggest example to me is what happened in Iran in the fall, where basically there was the most incredible set of protests led by women, since the 1979 revolution. And I do believe that the government in Iran is really in trouble. They may hang on. You cannot kind of question the ability of dictators to kind of hold on to power, and they have considerable tools at their command to stay in power, but they've really lost the consent of the people. And you also look at other countries around the world, even China, by the way, one of the most restrictive governments in the world from the point of view of personal liberties. There were widespread protests against the COVID restrictions that were enacted by the Chinese government. And the Chinese government was responsive to those. They had to change their COVID policies because people were so upset about them. So I do think this kind of protests signals to me that there is a demand from people for human rights and democracy, and that eventually, I'm hopeful, and that this is what we're pushing for at Freedom House, that governments will be much more responsive to the demands of the people for freedom. Let's go to the next slide. U.S. democracy. The rabbi told me you're going to want to talk about that a little bit, so I would expect we could talk about that in the question and answer. But let me just say a word here. I think if you look at what's happening around the world, two basic trends. I'm really making this very simplistic, but I think it's basically true. You have authoritarian powers kind of getting stronger, but you also have backsliding in established democracies, and the United States is not immune from that trend. I think, to give you the straight numbers, we provide a score for every country in the world on a 0 to 100 scale. 12 years ago, the United States was at a 94 out of 100, very high. Over the last 12 years, the United States has kind of gone down to 83 for the last couple of years. And so the United States had kind of been the peer from point of view of democracy relative to Western Europe, some of the Scandinavian countries, and now it's performing from a democratic point of view lower than that. We can unpack that a little bit, but a point I would like to leave you with is that having a functioning democracy is not just about having free and fair elections, which are really important, and I believe that the elections in the United States are free and fair. We have a good media here, but there have been, there are other trends that we've been concerned about. Attacks on the judiciary, political polarization, a number of other things that we could unpack. So I think just the broader point, and by the way, it's not just happening in the United States, that democracy is about more than having free and fair elections. It's protecting the rights and institutions that kind of buttress democracy. So that's a point I'd like to say. Final slide. Over 50 years of Well, let me start this in a more positive way. One thing that's very interesting about trends of the last 50 years is that you've had countries kind of moving along the democratic spectrum from not free to partly free to free. You know, an example of that would be, you know, a country like Poland or Hungary. And despite some of the problems that I identified, they're still free countries. Poland is. What's interesting is that progress has kind of slowed, and there are also 12 countries listed here that over the course of the entire 50 years of our report have always been not free countries. I mean, they're to be expected here. There's China, there's Saudi Arabia, South Sudan, I can't see all, North Korea, a number of other countries. And so I think, you know, they're still waiting for their chance at freedom, and I'm hopeful that even in those countries you see demands for freedom. You think about the protests in Cuba 2 years ago that really kind of shook the regime, and I think at some point they're going to have to be responsive to the demands of the people. Is there one more slide there? Let's just see what next. Let me talk about our recommendations. So by the way, one thing that's great about Freedom House is that we not only tell you what's wrong with things, but we try to provide some recommendations about what to do about it. So let me just sort of give you 5 key recommendations that we think about at Freedom House. Number 1, help Ukraine win the war. We think that's really important. Number 2, we are very strongly in favor of supporting human rights defenders. Our view is that people on the ground in these countries that are struggling for freedom are the ones that know best about what to do, but they deserve our support, financial, moral, other kinds of support. Stop enabling autocrats. I think one thing that's been interesting, that's been well reported over the last 10 years, has been the propensity of countries like Russia in particular, but a number of other countries where the kind of oligarchs in those countries have kind of stashed their ill-gotten gains in Western bank accounts. And that is something that we've been quite concerned about. So stop enabling autocrats is a third recommendation. I talked about freedom of the press, protecting free expression, really important. And then I also think a final thing that I would say is really extol the virtues of democracy. I think we're in, it's kind of interesting, we're in a period where, and when I took over Freedom House 6 years ago, I thought that the virtues of democracy were going to kind of be self-explanatory, right? That I would have to, you know, just, but no, you know, countries like China, Russia, others, and I find this in my just day-to-day work with critics from other countries about us, they often make the case that, well, no, it's better to be living in an autocracy because we can, you know, it gives us more stability, more order. But, you know, democracies protect human freedom. Democracies tend to be more prosperous, and democracies don't go to war with each other. And so they're more peaceful. And I think there's pretty strong evidence in the academic writings about those things. So I think we have to be more aggressive about making the case for democracy. I think that's it for the final. So anyway, I'm going to stop there, Rabbi, and then I hope I've given you enough to kind of work with. Thank you very much.
So in a moment, if you have questions, some folks will be coming around with question cards and pencils. So if you have a question that you would like to ask of Mike, please signal to Rabbi Jessica, and she'll come by with a card. But Michael, the first question I want to ask you, you alluded to a moment ago, which is you've been with Freedom House for 6 years. And your journey from journalism to working in the Holocaust Museum and Holocaust education to Freedom House, there's a trend there. But tell us a little bit about what drew you to this organization in particular and what you're hoping to accomplish in your time with the organization.
Well, thank you for that question. So I was a journalist for 24 years of the Washington Post, but I really was a journalist for longer than that because I spent my whole college years working on journalism, and I was on the high school paper. And basically when I was, you know, I didn't really want to do anything else besides be a journalist. And it's a great calling. I loved being a journalist. And I think, you know, being a journalist, you tend to think about defects in democracy from time to time. And then about 14 years ago, I sort of had a change of heart, and I wanted to kind of be a little bit more engaged than just on the sidelines. And for a strange kind of combination of facts, I was fortunate enough to be hired by the Holocaust Museum to run a program that they have, a very special program actually, which is about the prevention of genocide. I was at that time the White House correspondent for the Washington Post, and my mother thought I was crazy, but it actually turned out to be a good move. And so working at the Holocaust Museum for 8 years, I really do believe, and I talked about this last night at the Holocaust Museum in Naples, I do believe that one of the stories that's very powerful at the museum in Washington, the Holocaust Museum in Washington, is about the fragility of democracy. This was if you come to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, the 4th floor, which is the beginning, really focuses on the kind of deconstruction, the erosion of German democracy, in the first part of the Nazi rule, which was kind of amazing because the German government, Germany was one of the few democracies in the world before the Nazis took over, and Hitler took office by democratic means, essentially, and yet within 5 or 6 years, that country became one that was capable of genocide. So that's to me, a very awesome fact. Not awesome in a good sense, but something to really ponder. And so I've always been thinking about democracy. And then when the opportunity came to run Freedom House, I jumped at it because I do believe that this is, the major cause of our time. I joke with some friends who work in the environmental movement that climate change is existential, and climate change is certainly important. But I do think, the cause of human freedom is really a powerful one, and I do actually genuinely believe that democracy is under attack. I'm hopeful. I think we can. I'm not despondent about it, but I think it requires work to address.
Thank you. Let's set the groundwork for this. What is a democracy?
Good question. I would say when I think of a democracy, the fundamental word that in my mind is consent of the governed, right? Where the people of a country have a say in who their leader is. And the only way they can have a say is through an election. So I think that's the kind of fundamental precept of democracy. However, as I was indicating in my talk, I don't think that is enough, that you also have to have a free press, for instance, to kind of hold government to account and to inform the people about how their democracy is functioning. You have to have freedom of speech to be able to say what you want. You have to have a rule of law, an independent judiciary. You have to have checks and balances. I think that's a really important characteristic of democracy. And when too much power, and that was something that obviously the framers were quite concerned about, and they built a system that in some ways maybe even too unwieldy here in our country to make progress on certain issues. But I really think, the way we look at it at Freedom House, and by the way, it's reflected in the way we do our analysis every year, and I kind of short-circuited that issue, but we do a very careful job of looking at the these 25 different indicators in each country. Some of them are political rights, some of them are civil liberties, and there are countries, and a good example would be India, which have very fair elections, but they don't treat the minority groups very well there. There's more attacks on journalism. So democracy is not a binary thing. It's a continuum which we try to capture in our score.
So you mentioned the minority, because that's, for me, as I was thinking about this evening, and we were talking at dinner this evening, that in some ways it's the health of the minority groups that might be the indicators of the health of a democracy, where it's very easy for a majority to do whatever it wants. So what are the ways in which, as we're looking at a particular country or looking at what's going on in the globe, how do those indicators you suggested, the judiciary, the free press, or others, what are they able to do for the minority that the people themselves aren't able to do?
Well, I think the fundamental thing is that to have a healthy democracy, you need to have, majority rule, but also protection for minorities of all kinds. And I think one of the things to me that's very interesting about looking at our reports over the last 7 years while I've been at Freedom House is that the treatment of minorities is increasingly a problem around the world. This is not just a uniquely American problem, it's a global problem. First of all, you talk about the most extreme examples, like in China, which have terribly treated the Tibetans, the Uyghurs, really anyone who dissents from there. But in India, as I said, there are 200 million or so Muslims. They're increasingly under legal attack by the Indian government. This is a broader trend and one that we're deeply concerned about, and which also is part of this democratic decline that I've talked about, just less and less good treatment of minorities.
So I guess my follow-up to that is, which is the canary and which is the coal mine, right? Because if it's one thing to say, and not to diminish the plight of minorities in countries like China or in Russia, where there has been a long history, right? China was on the list of 12 countries who've never been not free. What's going on in the countries who of late have been democratic or have been historically democratic, but all of a sudden we're seeing both a rise in difficulties for minorities and a rise in problems facing democracy? Do we know what the cause is and what is the symptom and where these are coming from?
Well, let me say a couple things. First of all, the question of what's the canary in the coal mine is a really good question. I don't have a great answer for you. I certainly think three issues to me, and I'm probably going to forget something, but three issues to me are kind of warning signs for democracies, if you will. One would be what you said, how a government treats minorities. And by the way, I mean minorities broadly speaking. It could be ethnic minorities. It could be a political minority. That's number one. I think what I said there, I really do believe about an independent press. I think, that's been a real driver of democratic decline, attacks on the press. And something we can also talk about is kind of social media and how that also. And I think the other thing that I also think about a lot, and one reason I get concerned about our country a little bit, is kind of political corruption. If you think about, for instance, what happened in Russia over the last 20 years, and I think Russia is a very interesting story to kind of just talk about for a minute, because in the 1990s, after Gorbachev fell, after the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia was trying to be a democracy, not a perfect democracy. Freedom House rated it partly free, not unfree. So it was a country that was trying to get better. There was some reasonably fair elections. There was a lively civil society. There was a lively press. There were some of the building blocks to democracy in Russia, but some of the things that really were kind of, I think, should have been seen in retrospect as kind of alarm bells was the system was completely corrupt and rigged for very wealthy people who were, could game the system and really obtain access to state resources for nothing. And then I also think Putin, and this is an interesting point about Putin, now he sort of rules more by fear and by just raw violence, I would say. But in the early days, he was kind of skillful about his repression, if you will. So, for instance, he kind of basically took over. He had friends take over, or allies take over major parts of the media. He allowed independent media to still exist, but kind of marginalized them. So, in a sense, there was a state media, that kind of point of view, but that there wasn't really kind of an independent press that people paid too much attention to. So that would be an example, I think, of sort of the beginning warning signs, if you will, of a democracy in distress.
So let's stay with Russia and Ukraine for 1 second. You mentioned in your presentation that Ukraine and a free Ukraine, a democratic Ukraine, presents a threat to Russia. And that was, at least in part, what was motivating Putin for the invasion just over a year ago. But you also just said, and you alluded to the fact that in Russia, the government has almost complete control over the media, right? The folks who are living in the borders of Russia don't really know what's going on outside of Russia other than through the filter of what they see. And we've, for those of us who follow, have known that that has been part of the story of what's been going on between Russians and Ukrainians during the last year is very different stories. So can you help us understand, if the information walls are so thick between Russia and Ukraine, how does a free Ukraine, or how does freedom around the world pose a threat to someone like Putin, that he has to take this aggressive act along the other things, along the other awful things he does?
It's a good question. Let me just say this. I do think there's been quite a significant kind of brain drain from Russia, if you will. You know, even in the last year, I think 1 million Russians have left the country. You know, really the entire kind of liberal-minded populace has left Russia. Mm-hmm. And also, so I think it's very possible that Putin is popular inside Russia. I mean, I don't think we really know, to be honest, because I just think it's how can you gauge public opinion in what's essentially kind of a police state where people are not going to tell how they really feel to a pollster. You know, it's interesting. I had a conversation, and also he said this publicly, so I'm not disclosing this, but I was recently in Germany. I was at an event, and I met Garry Kasparov, the former world chess champion, who's a dissident. And Kasparov, I asked him, well, how is this going to end? How is Putin going to fall? He said, it will happen when the Russian people understand they're losing. Right now, they don't know that they're losing, and that they don't, and they are, they believe they're winning, and that NATO attacked them. So it goes to your point that there is that kind of control in terms of how people think.
So do we think that the situation between Russia and Ukraine is this a single event? Is this a one-off event? Obviously, it has its uniquenesses. Or is this something that we should be fear of spreading? Right? That other authoritarian leaders around the world, I'm thinking about China and Taiwan, I'm thinking about North Korea, South Korea, but is there a concern that this might become the first of many, the first domino, or will there be other proxies between democracy and authoritarianism that might bubble up as a result of what some might see as a successful campaign by the Putin regime?
Well, I certainly believe that many countries are watching what's happening there very carefully. They're watching both what Russia does, and they're also watching how the United States and other democracies behave. I really believe that. I don't know how this is going to end. I do think that what's interesting to me from our reports and different reports, by the way, in addition to having Freedom in the World, we do a report on internet freedom called Freedom of the Net. We've done a lot of other special reports about kind of the practices of authoritarian countries, how they act, how they operate, how they try to influence events beyond their borders, which is a big theme. I would say that one of the most important kind of themes of our reporting over the last number of years is that the authoritarian countries are helping each other. They really are. You think about two countries, Syria and Venezuela. You know, Assad in Syria has basically been propped up by the Russian government over the last 10 years, and Venezuela also propped up by the Russians and the Chinese. So they help each other, and that's why I think it's very important for democracies to help each other and come to the defense of others. So
you anticipated the next question, which was, how effectively are autocrats working together? Right, you mentioned a moment ago, but I want to get a little more specific. Right, it's one thing to see a country like Russia that has significant resource and significant means to influence a country like Syria or like Venezuela. But what about those countries that, when we think of who are the really problematic, the sources of the problems? It's China, it's Russia, Iran, North Korea. Are the leaders of those countries working together, or is it just that each one has its playthings that it plays with to cause problems around the world, or both?
I think both. I mean, first of all, there was I think we talked about it at dinner beforehand. You know, there was quite an interesting and potentially disturbing news last week about, China brokering some kind of rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which is deeply concerning.
Why?
It's concerning because I think that you would have potentially three essentially major authoritarian powers, working together, and that can't be good. By the way, I also think, first, I'm not an expert on this, so I'm freelancing a little bit here, but I do think that my sense is that there's such underlying enmity between Saudi Arabia and Iran that I'm a little bit skeptical that this is going to be something that was going to be a long-term thing, but we'll see if I'm right or wrong. One of the things that I think that's interesting is that there is an autocratic playbook, an authoritarian playbook. And I think Putin was probably the pioneer of this. We actually did a very interesting report at Freedom House, which you can find on our website, called Breaking Down Democracy, which really looked at the common patterns of behavior. And if you think about, in the basic theme of the report was that in in China and Russia, like in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, those dictators, they're really ruled by raw power, right? Stalin, murdered, millions of people. Mao, essentially murdered millions of Chinese people, after he took power in 1950. They're different tools. They try to co-opt the press. They try to, attacking the independent judiciary is part of the playbook. They try to basically, they basically are trying systematically to defang any possible source of independent check on their authority. And that is a playbook that you've seen playing out in Venezuela, in Turkey, even in a place like Hungary, and certainly Russia. I would say the country that is, I think, the most concern from a long-term point of view, from the cause of freedom, is China. And we could talk about that. But I think, China is now, compared to 20 years ago, is being much more aggressive about trying to really, undermine institutions that, even globally, that could check its power.
So let's stay there. China is, from an economic perspective, it has been an outlier even to some of the autocratic countries we've been talking about, because if we think about what Russia looks like today, it doesn't look like the old Soviet Union. It looks like a different country, perhaps economically. Talk for a moment about how a country's economic health and the realities of the economics in an individual country play into how they choose. And then let's have that conversation about China you just alluded to. What is it about China that is priming them to be not only authoritarian within their own borders, but to be able to export what they're doing around the world?
Right. Well, let me start with a statistic which I think is kind of interesting. So remember I was saying that we rate countries on a score of 0 to 100. So when President Xi took office in China 10 years ago, China scored 17 on the Freedom House scores, which is not a good score at all from a point of view of political rights and civil liberties. But at the time, under the previous administrations in China, there was kind of an opening up, right? It wasn't that China was going to be a liberal democracy like the US or France or something, but it was going to certainly be a much more open, and the hope had been that kind of the opening up of China, and kind of the economic success that China has enjoyed over the last 3 or 4 decades would lead to a political liberalization, and that did not happen. And so I think President Xi, for a variety of different reasons, really turned China into a much more repressive situation. I think the Chinese people were very shaken by Tiananmen Square. They were shaken by what happened to Gorbachev and the Soviet Union in 1991, and they wanted to do everything they could to avoid that. And there was a real concern that the Chinese Communist Party would kind of lose legitimacy. And so from a point of view of internal politics, President Xi has kind of turned things around, basically using repression. Now the question is, he's really enjoyed strong economic growth for a lot of his tenure, but that turned around under COVID. He is under enormous pressure, just like President Biden is, just like any president of a democracy, to deliver for people. And if he doesn't, he will be in trouble. And I do think that in the end, his success will be whether or not he can continue to deliver economic success for the Chinese people. And I think in the long term, we don't, people ask me all the time, does Freedom House look at economic freedom? We don't. Ours is really about political rights and civil liberties. But I do think in the long term, a system in which you restrict political rights and civil liberties, makes it difficult to have kind of the dynamism that you would expect in a free society. I mean, I think there is a connection between capitalism and democracy, even though it can be taken too far in some cases.
You mentioned COVID.
Yes.
And it has had effects on all the economies around the world and all the countries around the world. I'm going to turn around 3 times and spit as I say this, maybe coming out finally of the depth of the pandemic into a world where COVID is a thing that we are learning to live with, and it is not nearly as disruptive to our lives as it was a year, 2, and 3 ago. I'm going to spit again just to make sure that doesn't change in the near future. But here we are now, if I can use the phrase post-COVID or post-pandemic experience. What has changed? What has changed around the world as a result of this? Whether it's on the, we can talk about the economics, but from a freedom and democracy, where were the impacts and where did trends change? Where have new trends emerged as a result of the lack of that dynamism you alluded to a moment ago, being able to be in place when we were stuck at our home for, 3 weeks here in Florida and longer times in other places, depending on which place you were living in?
Right. Well, let me talk about this from a global perspective, and I appreciate the question because, I probably should have said, one of the factors in this global economic recession that I was talking about in the last 3 or 4 years has definitely been the way governments have exploited COVID to kind of diminish rights and freedoms. Now, I'm not just talking about mask wearing and that whole debate, but I'm talking about like in Hungary, the prime minister used the COVID restrictions to take emergency power to do things that went beyond public health measures. And you saw that in a number of other countries. You saw a number of different countries impose restrictions on the media that were kind of tied to COVID because they didn't like critical reporting about government response, and so they had these so-called fake news laws that would give them more power to restrict that. So I did think you saw during COVID more governments taking action to restrict civil rights and political liberties. And I think one of the interesting things now about our report last week is it showed that some of those restrictions are now being lifted. And that's one of the reasons why things are getting a little bit better.
Let's bring this home for a little while and talk about what's going on in the U.S. When I read the...
Do I have to?
We do. We do. When I read the annual report yesterday, I noticed something interesting, which is that there was a list of countries that had the largest 10-year declines in their democratic score, and I was surprised to see, I shouldn't say surprised, I was pained to see that the U.S. was on that list. It was at the bottom of the list, meaning of the countries that had the greatest declines, it had the smallest of the greatest declines. It was a 10-point decline over the last 10 years. But we were only 1 point fewer than Russia, who has gone down only 11 points in the last 10 years.
But we were like at 94, and Russia was like at much lower basis.
I understand, but that still concerns me more, right? Because we're the U.S. We're the world's greatest democracy. We tell ourselves we invented democracy, but we say that about ourselves. What's going on?
Well, let me make a point, if I could, Rabbi, that I think is important. One of the things that I really see at Freedom House in a way that is very special, I think, perspective, is that we work with civil society groups and others from around the world. And what's really both imbues a sense of responsibility, but also kind of is really a wonderful thing, is that people still look to the United States to be a beacon of democracy. Doesn't mean that we always live up to those ideals, and we could talk about the various imperfections, to call it nicely, that we've had with our democracy. But I do think the thing that I really always point out about American democracy is that we have these incredible founding documents with incredible aspirations, and we're in this effort to achieve those ideals, and we sometimes fall short, but we're moving in a good direction, and other countries look at that. Mm-hmm. So you think about what happened on January 6, 2021. That was a terrible thing for our democracy, just in and of itself, but it was also a terrible thing in the kind of image. It was a huge propaganda victory for countries like Iran, for countries like Russia, who basically, have no qualms about basically saying, well, the United States is just as bad. And by the way, of course the United States is not just as bad. I mean, those are really bad countries, and they have nothing to do with us. But it kind of reminds me that as much as people want to escape that kind of mission or role, that it's impossible to, because that's the way others look at us.
And you've measured a measurable decline in what's going on in this country. So can you say a little more than a word or two about what the examples are, what's going on in this country that led Freedom House to its assessments? And even one step beyond that, which is, what are the causes of those perceived changes?
Well, I would say every year it's there are different factors, and if you look over sometimes you move up with a point, sometimes you move back. I would say in general there are 3 or 4 different things that I think are kind of notable about U.S. democracy. One is kind of what I would say is kind of the influence of special interests in the political system. That's bad, and it's a continuing concern with relative to U.S. democracy. I think while we've made improvements in kind of things like, in historic level of in terms of addressing racial injustice, I think that's a continuing blight on our democracy. I think an issue that in recent years that I'm deeply concerned about is just the kind of disinformation that is causing a lack of trust in our election system that's really kind of unfounded, right? I think that it's very concerning to me that, by all accounts, the 2020 election was one of the most robust, fair, secure elections in American history, and yet people, don't believe that, and and so people are purposefully trying to undermine one of the important kind of linchpins of democracy, which is kind of faith in the system, faith in institutions. I do think this issue of political polarization is something that we're going to have to grapple with. I think that what's interesting to me, I actually do believe that Americans share more commonality about things than sometimes is portrayed in the press. Think about issues. Honestly, you think about some of the big issues, whether it's the economy. Yes, there are disagreements. There are always going to be disagreements in a democracy. But you think about issues like crime, immigration, and the other big issues. I think there's a lot, education. I think there's a lot of unanimity or more consensus around some of these issues, and the political system is not able to deliver results that reflect that consensus.
For the reasons you said before about special interests and...
Yes, exactly.
So you're in Florida.
Yes.
I know that this is it's a globally oriented organization, but I did want to ask, living in a state where we've had several well-publicized laws which, depending on your perspective, are either enhancing or diminishing freedom, I'm curious, as you look at a state, as a nation like the U.S., one out of 195 in the study, do you pay attention to what's going on only at the national level, or are you looking at individual states within the U.S.? And I appreciate that if you did that for every country around the world, you'd have a list of of constituencies that was in the thousands between every state in Germany and every state in every oblast in Ukraine and everywhere else. But do you look at the U.S. or can you say a word about differences in democracy within the U.S.?
It's a great question. Let me first start, again, if I can draw the group out globally, that this idea of regional variations in freedom is a real thing, right? That this is not unique to the United States. You know, there are different states in India. How, you know, so like when we analyze a country like the United States in terms of freedom, you have to look both at kind of the federal laws, right? So there are very strong, for instance, you know, anti-libel laws, libel laws in the United States. You know, there are really strong protections for the press legally that are quite strong, especially on a global scale, and that doesn't change from state to state. And then there are other things that do affect freedom that do change from state to state. An example would be abortion, right? 12 states now have, you know, very restrictive, I mean, essentially bans on abortion. You know, most countries, by the way, do have some kind of regulation on abortion, but not really the kind of bans that are in certain states here. So you always have to kind of basically look at both the regional and the regional and the kind of federal, the national elements that go into this, and you try to make an assessment every year, but both go into the scores.
Okay. So a couple of the questions that have come from the crowd have focused on the unique experience of American Jews being a minority. Right? We began our conversation talking about how one of the hallmarks of a democracy is that it advocates for, it protects, it respects the needs of its minorities. And as I said to you at dinner, I anticipated the question coming. You have an experience looking at one of our people's darkest periods in the Holocaust. And help us make sense of where we are right now, particularly in this country, right? When we know the very fast transition in Germany from the 20s to 30s to the 40s, and how quickly what was becoming one of the greatest places for Jews to live in the world changed so quickly. And when we just finished talking about how democracy in the U.S. is beginning to show signs of erosion, how scared should we be?
It's a very good question. I mean, the premise of my talk, the premise of what I believe in is that you can't take anything for granted, right? And so I do believe that you can't take our freedoms and our liberties and rights for granted. They have to be fought for. I mean, Ronald Reagan once famously said they has to be fought for every generation. And so I do believe that. I do believe, though, in our country, you know, institutions are strong. And I'll give you like one example. 60 or so courts in 2020 basically held strong and ruled out of order the kind of baseless attacks on the elections in certain states. So to me, that was a moment where kind of institutions held. So I feel more hopeful about this country. I actually genuinely feel hopeful about this country. I think, you know, the nature of our democracy is that there are all these different checks on absolute power, and kind of the antibodies have been kicking in. And so I do feel hopeful, but I don't take it for granted. I mean, I do think the issue, which I think was kind of embedded in your question about anti-Semitism, is of deep concern. I mean, it's hard to work at the Holocaust Museum and not be aware that there is a resurgence of anti-Semitism going on around the world, including in our country. And that's a very deep concern. I mean, as a Jew, I feel safe in this country. I know that some maybe don't. I don't know, but I do think that I think there's no doubt but an increase in anti-Semitism, but I feel that there's kind of a strong bipartisan denunciation of that in our country, and institutions are standing strong against that. So it's something to be concerned about. Scared, maybe, but I think I think we can deal with it.
I'm going to break the rule of a good question, which is a good question isn't one where I say my opinion and say, do you agree with me? But I'm going to do it anyway. I have been telling myself over these last few years, as these rise of anti-Semitic incidents, including here in our community, things like anti-Semitic flyering going on and public projections, what I've told myself, and you kind of alluded to, which is there's the anti-Semitism that comes from individual people in a community, and then there's what's the rest of the society, and particularly the government and political bodies, doing about it. And I've been telling myself, which is that the institutions are holding, like you alluded to, which is, yes, this is going on, but it's not changing people's minds in the community. And when they're able to, law enforcement and government are stepping in. In fact, there's a bill being considered right now by the legislature in Florida that would find ways to criminalize what was previously not criminal, like those projections, coming from Tallahassee of all places, suggesting that there actually is a lot of concern, as you suggested, of concern for the Jewish community on a bipartisan level. Do you agree with me?
I'm not sure. What's your basic
I'll make
point?
it simple. That the anti-Semitism we're seeing is private individuals, not institutional, not governmental, not societal.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think.
And it's not going to spread.
Deborah Lipstadt has always spoken about this is like the oldest. It's been around for thousands of years. It's never going to go away completely. Right. And I think it's in certain people's hearts for reasons that I can't totally explain to you. But I do think, I agree with you that I feel like the president, the Congress, on a bipartisan basis, states, I mean, they know this is wrong, and they're trying to do something about it.
Okay. Turning now to the place we'd all run to if we had to, which is the state of Israel.
Are we done yet?
We're not done yet. We're not done yet. The questions have come from there. What's going on?
That's a very open-ended question.
Yes, it is. I'll be a little more specific,
yeah.
Right? Because tonight's been about the trends, right, and what's going on. And so the way that I formulated when I took some time was just to say, are global issues in and around Israel, its local neighbors, or other trends? And we spoke earlier this evening about how historical democracies like India, for example, are having a bit of a backslide. Is that what's going on? Why all of a sudden do we see, why is everyone in this room concerned about the democracy in Israel when just 3 or 4 years ago we were saying, well, we're all going to go to Israel when we have to go to Israel if something should happen in the U.S.?
Well, let me just talk about this situation with the judicial plan that's been proposed by the Netanyahu government. I see that as kind of part of a global trend in a way, right? Where elected leaders are trying to, and I don't think it's unique to Israel, are trying to, what's the way? I sort of said it a few minutes ago. They're trying to, for power purposes, kind of get around limits on their power. And in Israel, for the last 15 or 20 years, the Supreme Court, the judicial has been a check on sort of unbridled kind of parliamentary power. I mean, there's not 3 branches there. There's, so there's other than the Supreme Court, a majority in the Knesset can basically do it at once. So I think I do see this as part of a general global trend of an effort by executives to kind of limit, and he's doing it for certain reasons to hold on to his power in the coalition, and there's been speculation that he's also doing it, to stay out of jail. I don't know for sure. But what's interesting to me, by the way, in terms, I've not been to Israel for 6 or 7 years, and I would not hold myself out as an expert on. But it's interesting that it seems to me that the response to what he's up to has been very strong. Hundreds of thousands of people in the streets about that, and I also feel that it doesn't neatly divide along the kind of conservative liberal, divides that you often look at. And I was saying to you at dinner, I was at a conference in Germany recently, and I saw the former Prime Minister Olmert speak at the conference. And he was this is a Likud politician, he was very critical of what Netanyahu was up to. And I also saw that, Miriam Adelson, who is, the widow of Sheldon Adelson, very conservative, she was critical of what the government was trying to do. So it doesn't, I think people do recognize that this is not just a political issue, but that there is something real. I mean, it seems to me, if you could imagine like changing the Constitution in our country by a single vote of one chamber of the U.S. Congress, you can't do that. Yeah, it's harder, and as it should be. It should be more difficult to change things like that.
So a couple questions came up, which I'll invite you to opine on, which are about specific issues, and knowing that your organization's look is about freedom and democracy. One is, do you look at access to medicine and medical freedom as a part of the calculus? And the other is, do you look at private ownership of firearms as a part of the conversation when you do your rankings?
The short answer is we have not really dealt with either of those issues in our rankings. As I said, that first question about medicine, that's an interesting question because the scholar Timothy Snyder, some of you might know Timothy Snyder, he's a big expert on the Holocaust, but he's also written very cogently about democracy, and especially on Ukraine, and I highly recommend his writing. He's very interesting. He wrote a whole book about, he had a kind of a challenge with the medical system, and he got very sick, and he happened to be in Europe. He lived in Austria as opposed to the United States, and all his health care was kind of taken care of. And so he wrote a whole book about, that's what freedom was about in his mind, having the freedom to address his disease. I'm a little bit mangling exactly what he said, but that's the point. But that's not really an issue that we've looked at, nor the firearms issue, to be honest.
Okay. A theoretical question.
I try not to answer hypotheticals.
No, it's not hypothetical. It's theoretical. It's different. Is there a better form of government than representative democracy? And does it matter on the makeup of the population?
I've thought about that question a lot in the last number of years for obvious reasons. I can't think of a better form of government, which is not to say that democracies are perfect. I talked about China. China is really making a strong case that they've cracked the code of, how to run it. And they by the way, they consider their country a democracy. They've called their country a democracy.
You disagree.
I disagree. So I guess the short answer is I've never in my mind been able to think of a country, a system that would be better. I still think that Winston Churchill's line that democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others still feels right to me.
Okay. There's one question. This has to do with the judiciary also, because it seems like that is becoming a recurring. It seems to be a recurring theme in especially some of the places where we're seeing the democratic backslide. That the judiciary, and this is part of the conversation in Israel, certainly could be framed as part of a conversation in the U.S., that the judiciary, which is an essential backstop, especially to protect the minority from the majority, as engaged citizens in a particular country, as people who are concerned, an independent judiciary seems to be both the solution and the problem, right? Because if they're independent, the citizenry really can't do much to defend them or hold them account in a moment where you're in a democracy that seems to be slipping away because of it. So what do we do then?
You're into asking tough questions. First of all, I do...
Only the best for Temple Beth El.
I do think that if you look at our reports over the last 10 to 15 years, you're absolutely right that a theme, as we analyze many countries, is efforts by populist governments to kind of defang, undermine, kind of judiciaries. I mean, the most famous example really is in Poland, where the government is in a fight with the European Union over changes to its judicial system that the European government, the European Union, I think, properly sees as kind of a, an effort to kind of weaken independent judiciary. So that's definitely a theme. I mean, but there's a democracy case too for, and Netanyahu's making it. It's not a terrible argument that that the elected bodies are supposed to should have the right to kind of decide these matters for society. But I think our point would be that in general, and it's going to take different forms in different countries, not the same everywhere, but you need to have some check on power, and that's where I think we come down on.
Okay. Recently, in the current issue of Foreign Policy magazine, Samantha Power, who was the UN ambassador and now is the administrator of USAID, wrote a very interesting piece called "How Democracy Can Win." Have you had a chance to see it yet? So she talked a lot about economic inequality, that really is one of the driving factors to erode a democracy. So I'm curious how that played into what you saw in the research that you and the organization did, and I'll tie that to how she concluded her argument or her piece, which is to say that democracy isn't in decline, but it's under attack. And so how do you assess her assessments?
I agreed. I thought that was a good article. I thought I read it and I thought it made some very cogent points, including the point that yes, I think her basic point that democracy is under attack by different kinds of forces is a correct point, and that we have to fight back to protect democracy. I also think in general that the general point that, look, there have been thousands of books written in the last several years about the decline of democracy, the decline of freedom, and so everyone has a different theory about what's going on here. But it does, and by the way, I don't think it's only economic, but I think the failure of many of the kind of Western democratic kind of liberal model to kind of effectuate equality, to effectuate growth for all sectors of society has had something to do with the ability of populists, in some case demagogues, to take power.
Okay, so I'm going to conclude with this. At the end of your presentation, you offered a series of prescriptions, things that we need: helping Ukraine, stopping authoritarian, celebrating democratic values like press and expression, protecting the defenders of democracy. Those are wonderful, but they're also macro. Those are global. Those are things that organizations do, that nations can do. You're in a synagogue. As you walked in, you saw on our social justice wall the phrase, "Lo tuchal hitalem," we cannot sit idly by. I am not a country. I am not a head of state. I'm not the head of an NGO. And while we have a wonderful organization here, we're a small organization in the scheme of organizations. What can we do? Right? We're here tonight because we're concerned. We're here tonight because we're concerned about the plight of democracy in our city, in our state, in our country, and in our world. This may not be what you often talk about, but I'm going to challenge you, which is, to the individual person, how can we help?
Actually, believe it or not, it's a question I get all the time, because it's a natural question, right? It's not this is not an abstract thing, right? And I often say there's not a single silver bullet to this, right? But I think one of the remarkable things about our country, and I really believe this, is that there is an incredible civil society and incredible associations, synagogues, churches, different Rotary clubs, and also where I sit from Freedom House, there's been an incredible outpouring of groups that have come together to protect democracy, to protect, to work on gun issues, to work on, to fight abortion restrictions. And to me, that's the genius of our country. So I always say, engage in these organizations. It's going to be different for different people, right? And I think, you know, I really do believe that I am hopeful for the future. I think if you look at the story of democracy over the last hundreds of years, it follows a very kind of similar pattern where there's a spurt of democracy, and then there's kind of it impels backlash, and then we keep going. And so I think it's really up to individuals to participate in the system, to vote, to volunteer, to get involved. I really think it's up to us all individually to play some role in the fight for democracy.
I think we should end with that. Michael Abramowitz, thank you so much for being with us this evening.
It was great to be here. Thank you so much for coming out.
You can learn a lot more about Freedom House on the website, freedomhouse.org. And you can join all of us in the Beit Midrash outside to our left. There will be coffee and desserts for the conversation to continue. I look forward to seeing you in the future. And if you do want to help support Freedom House, any donations you make into the tzedakah box this evening and tomorrow night at Shabbat will go to help the work as well. Thank you for those of you who joined us virtually, and I wish everyone a pleasant evening.